Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Jaipur Literature Festival at the British Library Entrance Hall. We have now Nathaniel's Nutmeg, the spice trader who changed history by Giles Milton, introduced by William Dalrymple. Can we please have a round of applause for them? Please ensure your phones are on silent mode. Should you need to have an urgent conversation, please take it outside. No flash photography is permitted.
One of the privileges of being able to program something like this is to be able to invite your favorite authors and then cherry pick them a second time for the London edition. Last year, well, every year when we have try and work out what we're going to take onto the London edition of Jaipur, we go through the sessions which we've most enjoyed at the Jaipur, and in the whole of the festival we must have about 260 sessions each festival, 5 days, 5 venues, dawn until dusk writers. And I have to say, of all the sessions I attended this year, Giles Milton's Nathaniel Nutmeg was the most beautifully polished and prepared and delivered presentation that I attended. So you have a real treat in front of you. Although this, normally with literary festivals, authors are invited to give their latest work. Giles's most recent book is called The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, which is set in Arisaig and the West Highlands and other parts of Europe. So we thought less appropriate for a Jaipur festival than to take him back to the origins of his writing and this book, which really made Giles a household name and a best-selling writer, Nathaniel's Nutmeg. So I'm going to get off the stage now and let Giles tell this extraordinary story. You have a treat in front of you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, thank you. Well, we begin with our story with this little fruit here. It's about the size of an apricot. It's green when as it begins to ripen, and then it turns a yellowy orange color as it grows into maturity. It's about the size of an apricot. And to botanists, it's known as Myristica fragrans. That's its botanical name. But to the merchants of Elizabethan London, this was known as nutmeg. Now, the merchants were not remotely interested in the fleshy outside of the fruit, which is nowadays turned into a rather revolting, sickly, glutinous jam. What they were interested in, is... Technology always defeats me at the beginning, is the inside of the fruit. So if you peel off the flesh, you get this rather wonderful red, lacy outer core, which is the mace of the fruit. But even that was not what the merchants were interested in. They, of course, were interested in this, the innermost heart of the nutmeg. In Southeast Asia, where they were buying this, 10 pounds of this cost a couple of pennies. In London, it's sold for £2 and 10 shillings. That is a monumental markup, which is why that they were prepared to risk their lives and sail halfway around the world to buy this nut. But why on earth was this, which most of you probably got tucked away in your kitchen, you bring it out once a year for mulled wine or for making your bechamel sauce for your lasagna? Why was this so valuable? Well, there's a clue in the picture here, I think. This was the Elizabethan age. This was an age of ostentation. It was an age of wealth. It was an age of luxury. And anything that was rare was much sought after by the rich, particularly the rich merchants, the rich mercantile class of London. And what better than some exotica from the furthest flung corners of the world? So sea captains who set off on these voyages, they were asked to bring back rarities. One captain was asked, remember to do your best to bring for the Lord of Salisbury some parrots, some marmosets, or other strange beasts and fowls that you esteem rare and delightful. And of course, the rarest commodity of all was nutmeg. If you had nutmeg on your table, you were really showing that you were an incredibly wealthy person. But it's worth just dwelling on one other thing on this picture. Note the Queen's hand. lightly caressing the globe there. Note the ships in the background. This, of course, was the beginnings of the golden age of exploration. Ships were beginning to sail far and wide. So we have Sir Martin Frobisher going off up into the northwest passage. We have the great voyages of, under the auspices of Sir Walter Raleigh going off and trying to settle a colony in America. And of course we have Sir Francis Drake sailing around the world, 1577 to 1580. But Nutmeg was not just about extravagance and voyaging. It was also believed, it was said, to help to cure the plague, the pestiferous pestilence as it was known. And so those who could afford it, when the plague struck London, walked around with these peculiar beaks attached to their faces. And these beaks were filled with nutmeg, with mace, with cloves, with black pepper, with cinnamon, which was believed to help stave off this dreadful disease. Of course, it didn't work, but they didn't know that at the time. And by that time, they'd already spent their money on the spices. Every wealthy, costly commodity, it's always good if it has an extra added value. And of course, it was said that nutmeg was an aphrodisiac. It did wonders for your sex life, for your libido. It was a sort of Elizabethan Viagra, if you like. So this was another thing that made this little shrinkled little nut have the same value as gold. Now, part of the allure of these spices is they came from a very, very long way away. They came from the East Indies, from the fabled spiceries, which were so impossibly remote that no one really knew at the beginning, in the early days, where they were. The most obvious route to get there was to sail on the right-hand globe here, down the coast of Africa, round the Horn, and then across the Indian Ocean to try and find these mysterious, legendary islands. It was a terrible journey. Crossing the Atlantic, they ran short of water, they ran short of food, they got scurvy, they got caught in the doldrums, and then there was the Indian Ocean with the hidden reefs and all sorts of problems that they were to encounter en route. But if they made it on that sort of 2-year voyage, they would arrive here in what is now Indonesia. These were the fabled spiceries, the islands where spices grew like weeds. There was Ternate in Tidore, there was Sumatra, and there was Bantam. You may be able to see Jakarta on the map there in the bottom left-hand corner. Bantam was where the principal spice market in this entire region. So that gives you a pretty clear idea of the geographical area we're talking about. But this is the map that our Elizabethan sailors had to use to get there. Little wonder that many ships sank and many more never actually reached these islands. Even in the spiceries, where spices really just grew everywhere, even in the spiceries, nutmeg was the rarest of all the spices. It only grew in 6 islands in the world. This is the Banda archipelago, because nutmeg it required a very, very fussy climate and a very, very fussy soil. So it only grew on this one tiny and incredibly remote archipelago. You can see the main island, Gunung Api, is actually a volcano which kept erupting during this period, which had caused many, many problems. And then the other larger islands. But note, for our story, the 2 outlying islands on the left-hand side, you can just about see Pulu Run and Pulu Ai. These are going to be very important in the story that follows. And here they are slightly more geographically correctly positioned. Again, you see Run and Ai. Run is about 10 miles, a little bit more, away from the main group of islands. So this is the story we're going to cover today, but we're going to backtrack a little bit, because the story actually begins rather earlier, about half a century earlier, in fact, with this chap here, this bold adventurer called Sir Hugh Willoughby. Now, Sir Hugh was a merchant adventurer, and he wanted to reach the Spice Islands. But when he looked at his map, he saw the most obvious route was going down the coast of Africa across the Indian Ocean. But there was a problem. Many of the ports and harbours where they could go and get supplies and food and water had already been seized by the hated Portuguese and Spanish. So Hugh Willoughby looked at his maps again and came up with a rather novel idea. And that can be seen in this map here. Instead of sailing down the coast of Africa and into the tropics, why not go over the north of Scandinavia, which you can see in the top left there, that's Norway there. Why not sail along the north coast of Russia and then drop down into Southeast Asia? It would be so much quicker and you wouldn't have any problems with the Spanish and Portuguese en route. So this is what he decided to do. This was the route of his pioneering expedition to the Spice Islands, was going to take him across the top of Russia. And all went very well at the beginning. They were crossing the White Sea. They managed to capture polar bears, which they ate. They had plenty of food. And it was going pretty swimmingly at the beginning. But it began to get rather cold in the autumn. And then it got colder still. And the sea began to freeze. And tragedy struck Sir Hugh Willoughby when his ship got trapped in the ice. And as the ice, obviously the water expands when it freezes, it crushed his ship. And that was the end of Sir Willoughby's rather brilliant idea. They were eventually found a few months later by a rescue party. "We found them on the Muscovy coast," wrote one of those rescuers. "And they were frozen, pen still in hand, and paper before them, others at table, platter in hand and spoon in their mouths, like statues, as if they'd been placed in those attitudes." But it wasn't all doom and gloom, because there was a second ship on this expedition. And that second ship was captained by a man called Richard Chancellor. And he managed to put his ship into port just before winter and then trudge overland with all his men to Moscow, where he met with Ivan the Terrible. And Ivan the Terrible agreed to give Sir Richard Chancellor trading privileges. And this became what was to be known as the Muscovy Company. And the Muscovy Company was really a precursor to the East India Company. It began the idea of merchants coming together, pooling their wealth on these fantastically expensive expeditions, and thereby sharing the risk of the dangers that they faced en route. So now we move forwards to 1600 and to this man here. This is Sir Thomas Smyth, and he was a sort of rather an entrepreneur, a very successful businessman. He'd financed already a number of key expeditions, notably the attempt to colonize the New World. And so he was the prime mover in setting up the East India Company, which was established in 1600 to go and set sail with a fleet of ships off to the East Indies. He chose as his first commander this man here, Sir James Lancaster. I suppose in modern parlance you might call him a safe pair of hands. He'd sailed all over the place already and come back alive, which was no small feat in these days. See the typical posture with the globe and the ship in the background. So he was known as something as a gruff old sea dog. He was also a strict disciplinarian. He believed that these ships had to be run like sort of military units, and so he would say that he had severe penalties against the blaspheming of the name of God and of all idle and filthy communications. Interestingly, he always had his men, the health of his men, at heart, and he discovered something that was forgotten, which was that obviously scurvy was the scourge of these voyages. Men fell sick of this dreadful disease. And he discovered, quite by himself, that if he gave his men a teaspoon of lemon juice every morning, they didn't get scurvy. And none of his men ever died from scurvy. And this was actually forgotten for another 200 years. This was actually a cure for this terrible disease that men got at sea. This is the ship in which he was intending to sail for a voyage which would take some 3 years. It was 600 tons, it was seaworthy, it was very sturdy, made of British oak, but it was absolutely minuscule, the length of a couple of London buses. And on this ship, they had to carry all their water, their beer, all their provisions. They didn't know when they were going to get more food. And they also had to carry several hundred extra men because they knew that so many were going to die en route that they would need men to replace those that had died. So anyway, off they set with down the coast of Africa. The voyage was, by all accounts, pretty awful. They got stuck in the doldrums, that awful area of the Atlantic where there is no wind, and without wind, obviously, you can't move. You use up all your food. There are tales of the water on board and the beer on board being so full of flora and fauna that they'd have to sieve the water through their teeth to get all the bits out of it. Quite revolting, really. But they eventually made it to the Cape of Good Hope, where they put into port for the first time. And you've got to remember about these men that they were not exactly enlightened voyagers. And so when they got there, they were astonished by the people that lived at the Cape. The onboard priest, Patrick Copland, described them as very brutish savages who wear only a short cloak of sheep or sealskin, hairy side inward, and a rat skin about their privities. Well, the women shocked this priest to the core because he said that they would lift up their rat skin and show me their privities. He concluded in his diary that the world doth not yield a more heathenish people, nor more beastly. Well, they managed to get some food from these beastly people, and then they set off around the rest of the Cape. Now, this was probably the most dangerous part of the entire voyage. The sea is a swirling cauldron off the Cape, and many, many ships were lost there. And in fact, Sir James Lancaster himself had been caught in a terrible storm some years earlier. And he'd written back to London, and the letter he wrote became... it was refound by the Victorians who began to write about these heroic adventurers at the beginning of the golden age of exploration. And they loved one of the lines in his letters. He wrote, "I cannot tell you where you should look for me, because I live at the devotion of the winds and the seas." All good heroic stuff. Now they set sail, once they'd rounded the Cape, off to what was called Achin in Sumatra, where the king was there to welcome them with many elephants, with many trumpets, drums, streamers, and many people. The biggest elephant, said Sir James, had a huge seat strapped to its back, and in the middle of the seat was a great basin of gold. Well, what was this basin of gold for? It was to contain this. This was Queen Elizabeth's letter, and Sir James had a stack of these on board because wherever they were going to go, they needed a letter from the Queen asking if, please, could the English start trading with these nations. The letter begins, it was addressed, I must say that the rulers' names, of course, they didn't know who ruled these places, so there was always a blank at the top of the letter, and Sir James would have to get his quill and hastily write in the name of the local ruler. This one was called Alauddin, who's described as our loving brother. He's glorified for his noble and humane usage of strangers. There's a phrase about how dreadful the Spanish and Portuguese are, and then it got down to substance. Trade, it said, not only breeds intercourse and exchange of merchandise, but engenders love and friendship betwixt all men. Well, Alauddin loved this. He got on famously with Sir James, and he granted them trading privileges. So that was one, a good point to start off the voyage in the East Indies. Lancaster then set sail for Bantam, which I mentioned earlier. Bantam was really the center of all the spice trade that was done in the whole of the East Indies. So you really had to come here if you wanted to buy spices. Here you can see the town in the background, and a couple of ships doing battle in the harbour, which is a not uncommon occurrence especially between the English and the Dutch. There were often clashes there, and we have a picture of the town. The town itself. Of course, here it looks rather orderly and well kept with sort of nice palm trees growing and everything. But in fact, Bantam was a truly atrocious place to live. It was surrounded by swamps which were filled with malarial mosquitoes. It was filthy, it was insanitary, and the men very rapidly fell sick here. They called it that stinking stew was their term for Bantam. And one said, Bantam is not a place to recover men that are sick, but rather to kill men that come thither in health. The city was much larger than it's shown here, and it was truly international. Many, many different nationalities living here from right over the region, including Chinese and Japanese. But the problem when Sir James arrived here was that all sense of order had broken down. There was an 11-year-old on the throne, but it had been carved up into rival sort of fiefdoms. And here's one of those rulers who Sir James was trying to do business with, but it was very, very difficult to do. And here is the spice market itself. This was where you had to come to buy your spices. Now, what Sir James Lancaster decided to do was to found a factory. Now, a factory in the East India Company terms is not like a modern-day factory. It's like a trading post, really. It's a place where men came to do the business of spice. And he decided to set up a factory and leave 3 factors behind. These were William Starkey, Edmund Scott, and Thomas Morgan, who were to become traders in possibly the most challenging market in the entire world. There was not only the sickness to contend with, but there were all those other nationalities who were not exactly best pleased to see yet another nation pitch up here to try to do trade. There was violence, there was fire, there was all sorts of terrible things went on, notably torture. This is a picture. Actually, this is the Dutch torturing an Englishman here. This is an early form of waterboarding where you put a canvas bag over somebody's mouth and basically tipped water into it. And to stop themselves from drowning, they had to keep drinking until they became utterly bloated. A quite revolting way to deal with your enemies. But the English were not immune from indulging in a spot of torture when they captured people. They were furious that people kept trying to set fire to their factory, which was made of wood, of course. Edmund Scott, one of those factors, he said, "Oh, this word fire, had it been spoken near me in English, in Malay, in Javanese, or in Chinese, yet had I been asleep, I should have leaped out of my bed." Well, on one occasion, Scott captured one of these would-be arsonists, and he punished him in the style of the time. And what's quite extraordinary about Edmund Scott's diary is that you'd think if you were going to torture somebody, you might keep it a little bit quiet, but not a bit of it. He left a graphic account of exactly what he did to the chap. He said, "First I caused him to be burned under the nails of his thumbs, fingers and toes with a sharp hot iron, and then I caused his nails to be torn off. Then we burned him quite through the hands, and with rasps of iron tore out the flesh and the sinews. After that, the bones of his fingers and toes were broken with pincers." And so on, and so on. It goes on for 4 pages, the method in which they tortured this poor person and then shot him to pieces with their muskets. Well, Sir James Lancaster never made it to the Banda Islands, to the Nutmeg Islands. He sailed for home with a ship full of spice, which sold very well on the London market. And it was left to the next voyage, which was run by this man here, William Keeling, the discoverer of the Cocos Islands, to set sail and go to the farthest east to make it to the Nutmeg Islands. He's one of my favourite characters, actually, of this period. Rather endearingly, he was very much in love with his wife, and he really wanted her to come with him on the trip to the East Indies, which was strictly forbidden under East India Company rules. Anyway, he took her on board anywhere, and they were sailing down the channel when the London directors got wind of it, and they sent a ship after him, and they brought poor Mrs. Keeling off. And it was said that when he arrived back 2 years later, she was on the cliffs of Dover waiting for him. So a rather nice story. He was also very fond of the plays of Shakespeare, which of course had only just been written, and it is said that both Hamlet and Richard III were performed off the coast of Africa. He had all his men dress up. It was a good way to keep them occupied on the journey. Well, here we are. He sailed all the way across the Indian Ocean and he arrived in the Banda Islands. You can see the volcano erupting. As I said, it kept doing that rather annoyingly for the people who lived there. And Keeling was quite enchanted by these islands. A fair, spacious harbour, he said. The natives were friendly and he could buy staggering quantities of nutmeg. But it was most unfortunate that he discovered when he arrived here that he wasn't the first to get here. The Dutch, the hated Dutch, had already arrived, and he picked up rumours that, as he said, they mean to surprise us. So what he did was move his ships away from the main group of islands and move them to those two outlying islands that we saw earlier, Run and Eye. And it was just as well he did, because as he did that, a huge Dutch fleet arrived. He did it in the nick of time. But that Dutch fleet came with a commander who built this fort on the main island, a very strong fort armed with cannon, which basically gave the Dutch control over that central part of the archipelago where most of the nutmeg grew. And so that left, I think we have actually a picture of it. Yes, here is the fort today. I have to say these islands are staggeringly beautiful. When you go there, they're lush, they're covered with nutmeg trees still, and every island has a crumbling old stone fort on it with rusting old cannon, and you can find musket shot in the sand and everything. So William Keeling had to get away from the main islands, and he sailed to Eye Island. Here's a picture of Eye today. Tiny little island, but again covered in nutmeg trees, and he was able to buy a lot of nutmeg and sail away and get back to England and see his wife and be reunited on the cliffs. So it all went very well. As he set sail, another ship arrived, another English ship run by David Middleton, who thought this game of cat and mouse with the Dutch was rather good fun, and he intended to play it for all it was worth, because, as he said rather humorously in his diary, in troubled waters there is good fishing. So he played at this wonderful game of cat and mouse with the Dutch, and then eventually he thought, actually, maybe it might be a good idea to get on with the Dutch. So he invited the Dutch commander, Hendrik van Bergel, to dinner. So there passed between us words, he says, some sharp and some sweet, but at the length they began to be more mild, and the governor called for a cup of wine, and then the company all rose, and we drank a cup of wine together. So it all seems to be going quite well. But at this very moment, this man arrives on the scene. This is Jan Kern, who's been appointed the governor of the Dutch East India Company, and he detests the English, and he wants a monopoly on the entire spice, all the spice islands out in the East Indies. His catchphrase was, "Despair not, spare your enemies not, for God is with us." He would think of absolutely nothing. Here we see a sea battle that's very typical of the time, of attacking the English ships wherever he found them. In the Bay of Bantam was a particular favourite, and he was responsible for some of the worst torture that took place. The picture you saw of the waterboarding, that was under Jan Kern's tenure as Governor General. But then he said, well, of course I will do this, because the English, he said, threatened to hang me in effigy on the highest gallows of England and to pickle my heart. So we move to this fort here. In the spring of 1614, another English expedition arrived in the Banda Islands, and the Banda Islanders, by this point, are complaining to the English that the Dutch are proving appalling masters. They're torturing, they're killing, they're absolutely ruthless in their quest to acquire spices. One of them told the English captain, "God hath sent the Hollanders as a plague unto us, making wars upon us, and by unjust proceedings seeking to take our country from us." Well, Weldon, he procured a large cargo of nutmeg at Eye Island, but what happened once he'd done this is the Dutch attacked the island and massacred all of the island chieftains there, and they built this great fort there. One man who was there who witnessed the execution said it was awful to see. The headmen died silently, without uttering any sound, except one of them, speaking in the Dutch tongue, said, "Sirs, have you then no mercy?" So once they'd all been killed, the Dutch built this fort on Eye Island, And that left only one island left that wasn't under Dutch control, and that was Run Island. And it was to Run Island that this man here, this is taken from the BBC, they did a sort of adaptation of the Great Siege of Run. So this man here, Nathaniel Courthope, who is the Nathaniel of the title of my book, he came to Run, and he was determined to defend this island at all costs. He was absolutely determined to stop the Dutch having a global monopoly on the nutmeg trade. We have his diaries and letters. He was, by all accounts, he was resolute, fearless, and really he made the defense of Run his great goal in life. And here we have a map of the island. So you see, he had certain things in his favor. It's about 10 miles or more from the main group of islands. So the Dutch would have to sail there to if they wanted to attack the island. And also Courthope had very good relationships with the local chieftains, the local islanders, who knew that if the Dutch come, they would suffer the same fate as their fellow islanders on Eye. The East India Company had told Courthope, at your arrival at Run, show yourself courteous and affable, for they are a peevish, perverse, diffident and perfidious people, and apt to take disgust on small occasions. Well, in fact, Courthope forged very good relationships with them. Here's some of the headmen of the island. And what they decided to do, that in return for the Dutch protecting them militarily, against the Dutch, the English protecting them against the Dutch, they would sign over their island to King James. They would make him basically honorary king of this island. So one quote from one of the documents from the men that were there says that, and whereas King James, by the grace of God, is King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, he is also now, by the mercy of God, King of Pulau Run. And one wag at the time joked that Pulau Run would prove far more profitable than Scotland had ever been. There was one clause put in by the headman. They said that we desire of His Majesty that such things that are not fitting in our religion, as irreverent usage of women, maintaining of swine in our country, forcible taking away of men's goods, misusing of our women, or any such like, not be put into practice, which suggests that all these things were in practice generally. So with his treaty now in hand, Courthope decided to try and defend this island, which, the Dutch had several thousand troops at their disposal, and he had only a handful of men, about sort of 30 or 40 men. So he faced a fairly difficult task, but the geography of the island made it considerably easier. We will see the island from this is the island as seen from the east, in fact, as seen from Eye Island. And there is only on Run Island one harbour. So Courthope knew that obviously if the Dutch were going to attack him, they'd have to capture this harbour. So he placed a lot of his cannon and muskets and everything strategically round the harbour, making it as difficult as possible for them to come on land. And this is, you see, the rest of the island is faced with cliffs like this, almost impossible to climb up and attack. So although he faced a difficult task, it was not an impossible task. But this is the man who is charged with trying to get Courthope off his island and capture the island for the Dutch. His name is Lawrence Real. He was a brilliant lawyer, brilliant scholar, and he had command by this point of over 1,000 men to try and attack this island. And of course, although Courthope was quite strongly placed militarily on this island, Run had very little natural water supply and very little food as well. And so the Dutch knew this, and as the months went past, they kept demanding that Courthope surrender. And he valiantly wrote back to them, I could not surrender unless I should turn traitor to my king and country, and also betray the country people who've surrendered up their land unto our king's majesty. Well, Real was absolutely furious by this, and it was said he threw his hat on the ground and pulled his beard for anger. He was a man used to getting his way. Well, why didn't the English send some ships to come and help Courthope? they really didn't have any ships to send to help him. But in the spring of 1617, one vessel did get through. And you can imagine the situation on the island. The men are starving. They're desperate for more munitions, and they see an English ship on the horizon. They give a great cheer. This is what they've been waiting for so long. But just as it comes within view, the Dutch set sail, and they go and attack this ship. The crew, as it was said at the time, the crew put up valiant resistance, shot for shot all that afternoon, but their powder was naught, and they could not carry their shot home. After 7 hours, the Dutch captured the ship, the Solomon, and she was towed away as a prize ship. And that brings us back to Fort Revenge on Island, because this is where the unfortunate men who were on board of that ship ended up in prison in this place here. It was called Fort Revenge, and that was a very apt name for it. Here is an account of what happened to the Englishmen in this fort, because the Dutch really enjoyed tormenting them at this point. They pissed and shat on our heads, said one, and in this manner we lay until such time as we were broken out from top to toe like lepers, having nothing to eat but dirty rice and stinking rainwater. We were very hardly and inhumanely used, being fettered and shackled in the daytime and close locked up at night in most loathsome and dark stinking dungeons. They would then bring them out in the day, put them on stakes to burn in the sunshine, and then chain them underground again, where their ordures and piss fell upon us during the night. Well, the English East India Company did eventually do something. They sent out Sir Thomas Dale, who can be seen here. Now, he made his name for himself in North America, and he, in fact, brought back Pocahontas to England. He was a heroic man who it was felt that he'd be able to do something for Nathaniel Courthope. He was sent out to the East Indies, and unfortunately, he fell in with a Dutch fleet and was roundly trounced and had to go, he set sail back off to India, where he died of dysentery. It was a very inglorious end for the attempt to rescue Nathaniel Courthope and his men. By this point, they were starving. They had so little food. Courthope wrote in one of his letters, "We have rubbed off the skin already, and if we rub any longer, we shall rub to the bone." The only consolation was that London was very proud of this plucky, enterprising man stuck on his island on the other side of the world. But after a while, after several years of standoff, Courthope could stand it no longer. His men were in such a terrible state that he decided to go over and talk to islanders, the chieftains of the other islands, try and do a deal, some sort of military deal with them. And he was ambushed at sea, and there was a shootout, basically, and it was 40 against 1 was how it was described by his boy William, and his gun being choked, he could fire no more. He received a shot in the breast, and he sat down, and then he leapt overboard in his clothes, and he was never seen again. And that really might have been the end of this story. The Dutch had got their 6 nutmeg islands. They had got their global monopoly on nutmeg. They could set the price. They controlled the entire market. That seemed like it was it. The English had lost. But there was to be a surprising twist in the story. Because what happened is that the English were so furious with what the Dutch had done that they sailed across the Atlantic to this place here, which was called New Amsterdam. And they seized it from the Dutch. And in the ensuing treaty that was done between the Dutch and the English allowed the Dutch to keep their beloved island of Pulau Run, thereby having their global monopoly on nutmeg. In return, they took New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. Here we have the first picture of the city of New York, and here we have the island of Run. New York and Run. One can only wonder out of this deal who got the better half of the bargain. The Dutch got their beloved island, and the English got theirs, New York. And it all happened, as it said, because of an old nursery rhyme. It was all because of a little nut tree. There we go. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't know if anyone's got any questions or wants to ask anything. Two people.
If somebody wants to go to Rum these days, how would they get there?
It's even today, it's extremely difficult to get there. When I was going to fly in, they had a little sort of Cessna plane that flies in there. It crashed the week before I went. So I had to go take a boat, a 9-hour ferry to get to the main island. But once you get to the main island, I really wanted to get to Run to go and see the forts there and everything. And there you have to hire a local boat. And I went there during the monsoon, and it was one of the most terrifying things I've ever done, to cross over 10 miles of sea in the monsoon in a little boat with absolutely no safety precautions whatsoever. And then when I finally sailed out and sailed back to Amboina, I noticed that the ship we were on was listing quite heavily, and I said to somebody, is it my imagination, or is this ship listing? And he said, oh no, the captain ran it aground, and there's a hole in on one side of the ship, so part of the ship was full of water. It's an adventure to get there. But once you're there, it's a truly amazing place, astonishing.
Hi, yeah, when you were talking about Elizabethan, St James, Lancaster.
Yes.
Yeah, going off with all these letters from Queen Elizabeth and arriving and then putting the names in. But I mean, why would a letter written in English have any effect on, were the translators in all these places? I mean, how did what happened with the language barrier?
That's a very interesting question, and one I wondered originally. But of course, in all of these, or many of these ports, there were Portuguese and Spanish. There were Dutch already there, and many of these people had learned the local languages as well. And so, the irony of it, the English had to end up using their enemies to translate some of their letters and these treaties and everything. And most notably, that happened most interestingly perhaps, it happened in Japan, where the English tried to get a foothold in Japan. And there, the Jesuits detested, the Portuguese Jesuits detested the English, and nevertheless had to translate their letters. So there was a very delicate sort of diplomatic operation going on there. You've got to remember also that many of these sailors were multilingual. Many of them, even though they were very poorly educated, they spoke maybe 2, 3, 4 languages, some of them. So, William Adams, who sailed to Japan, he spoke fluent Dutch, and he learned Japanese within a year, and he ended up speaking fluent Japanese. So they were brilliant linguists, I think, because they had to be.
You very proudly say, who got the best deal between New Amsterdam and Run. But basically, it's like two rapists fighting over the same corpse. Basically, the English were rapists, the Dutch were rapists. The world was being raped by globalization, and so you probably are saying this because the globalized world of today is an exact copy of what they were trying to do. So you're justifying, in fact, with your book, even though you pretend to help, say, the people of Run, poor things, protected by the British, in fact, you're protecting the status quo today, which is rape of the planet.
Well, we had a very interesting session yesterday about the dishonorable East India Company. Which was exactly about that. In no way am I defending what these people got up to at all. It was appalling. The ideal set out in the charter of the East India Company was that this was a purely trading company, but of course things turned horrifically brutal, and I in no way justify the behavior.
This triumphalism shows exactly what's the problem, because you say, we rate better than them. Meaning what? Meaning what?
Well, anyway.
New York, they are now raping the world. Wow, your friends were rapists. It's fantastic. Good luck. You're not taking it. The rest of the world's not taking it. This is my Vladimir Putin. You see, he's fighting for the other side. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for your comment.
On a slightly lighter note, do we know where nutmeg originally actually came from?
Well, as far as I'm aware, it only grew on these islands. And what happened is that, in fact, the English, when the Dutch took control of the Banda Islands, the English took seedlings with them and then transplanted these seedlings in the Indian subcontinent and then, of course, in the West Indies as well. But as far as I'm aware, at that time it only grew in these islands. And it is a very difficult crop tree to grow. Even Kew Gardens have had a nightmare trying to grow a nutmeg tree. Yes.
I'm interested in how communication went on between this far-flung islands and places and London.
Yeah.
I mean, you're saying that a return journey could take up to 3 years. So how was Nathaniel able to communicate to them the peril that he was in? And you know, what were the method of communication those days?
Yeah. Okay, so it was all done through letters. And what's, I think, interesting when I came to research this book and other books I did on the similar subject is that all the letters, all the diaries, everything that was ever written is in this building here, underneath our floor, the floor here. And so what happened is that they would write letters, and even when the English and Dutch were at war, they had an understanding that they would take each other's letters back to their home countries, because they simply had to. The Cape of Good Hope was used as a staging post, and things were left there and then picked up by ships coming and going, basically. But no, it could take many, many months for a letter to get back to England. And this caused problems as well, because the Dutch and the English were forever at war and not at war. And of course, out in the East Indies, they had no idea whether they were at war or not. Yeah, it was a cause of major problems, the time delay.
Just wondered, what is the origin of the belief that nutmeg could cure plague? Was it, I mean, why nutmeg? Why not cloves or something else? Or
I think it was purely because nutmeg was the most expensive of all. I mean, there's absolutely no veracity to the claim that it can cure anything. They also said it could help preserve meat. So if you covered your meat in nutmeg, it would preserve it. Absolute nonsense as well. But it was all part of the sort of to enhance the price of the spice. I can't hear. How long did? That I don't know. How long the nonsense continued, I don't know. But nutmeg remained a very expensive commodity. Don't know if there's any other questions. Anyway, I'd strongly suggest that people head off to the Banda Islands on holiday. They're a wonderful place. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Giles, for that wonderful session.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We'd like to thank our festival sponsors, Zee Entertainment, Rajasthan Tourism, Taj 51 Buckingham Gate Suites and Residences, London, BBC History Magazine and the Aga Khan Foundation. We welcome tweets with the hashtag ZJLFATBL. And if anyone wants to be on our mailing list, please give your information at the speaker and guest delegate registration at the Knowledge Theatre. And the most interesting tweets stand a chance to win a GLF gift bag. Thank you.